Consider this scenario. You're going down the hall at work, and there's a man who's blind coming towards you. Now, if you are blind, think about what usually happens in these situations. And if you're not, how do you navigate that hallway? Do you go all the way over to one side, try to let him pass without incident? I've done that before, flattening myself up against the wall silently, hoping everything goes smoothly. I don't do that anymore. Not because I don't want things to go smoothly, but because of what this man told me when I asked him, what are some subtle things that make you feel bad at work? His answer? The silently flatten yourself up against the wall thing. And what he said was, he knows that people aren't trying to hurt him when they do that. In fact, he knows they're trying so hard and awkwardly to help. But it still makes him feel like a burden and like he's not normal. And if people would just say hi, that would give him an audio cue to get down the hall better, and maybe they could greet him as well. He could greet them as well, and maybe he might have a question to ask you about work. These are the kinds of conversations I want to talk to you about today. How they happen, why they're such a big deal, and what we could do about them. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, sure, we're talking about microaggressions. And yes, that word has been used to talk about these kinds of interactions before. The word itself, however, can get in our way sometimes. First, imagine you're trying to help someone get down the hall, and then somebody calls it a microaggression. Well, you might react defensively, thinking, I wasn't trying to be aggressive. And then micro makes it seem like these aren't a big deal, which they very much are. Dr. Tiffany Jana and I co-wrote a book in which we tried to reframe and rename that very concept. We call these interactions subtle acts of exclusion, because that's what they are. Simply put, a subtle act of exclusion is when there's a disconnect between an intention and an impact. So my intention, what I'm trying to do, might be to bond, to ask a question, to compliment, to be helpful. And yet it lands in exactly the opposite way for the other person, as hurt, pain, exclusion, or stress. For the book, we researched all the different kinds of subtle acts of exclusion we could find in books, in articles, in our decades of work with organizations and people, in our personal lives, and of course, we each bring our professional backgrounds as well. I brought my research experience and insights from being a cultural anthropologist and a cognitive psychologist, having done research on these very issues. Now I work with organizations as they attempt to ensure that everyone feels valued and respected, that everyone has the same opportunities to thrive, and that everyone is free from discrimination and harm. Now, there's a wide range of interactions that can cause harm. On one side of the spectrum, we've got intentional, deliberate discrimination, exclusion. We usually know that when we see it. When it happens at work, we usually report it. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we've got examples like this hallway example, where people really are trying to do their best. And of course, there's a gray area in the middle. Now, for the book, Tiffany and I focused deliberately on the examples from this side of the spectrum. And we do that because those are the ones happening so frequently in our workplaces. Those are the ones causing real harm to people and to cultures, and yet they're still so confusing that they keep flying under the radar, unaddressed. That brings me to my first takeaway point. I'll have 7 scattered throughout the talk. You can't always know what is going to make other people feel bad. If you can see, for example, it's not like you've never thought about what it might be like to be blind, but maybe you haven't spent time with someone who is blind and seen what it takes to get down the hallway or use a computer or get a taxi. It doesn't make you a bad person that you don't know. You just have to be open to hearing and learning about those experiences. So many examples on this side of the spectrum came up during 100 interviews that I conducted leading up to the writing of the book. This person, for example, identifies as a Black woman, and she said that people are always calling her so professional at work. And she wonders, as opposed to what? As opposed to who? That brings us to the second takeaway. Words land differently for different people. If you come up to me after this talk and tell me I was so professional, I won't be upset at all. But it makes her feel inadequate because there's this implication that somebody who looks like her or sounds like her isn't expected to be professional. This man told me that when he tells people about a past boyfriend, there's this pause. And then they say, "Oh, okay." Nobody said anything bad, but that pause makes him feel not normal. That's the level of subtlety we're talking about here. And these kinds of interactions can happen along any dimension of difference: disability, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, age, body type or size, socioeconomic status. Now, disbelievers sometimes say to me, "Well, it seems like you can't say anything these days, right? People are so sensitive. What's the big deal?" Let me tell you what the big deal is. Research shows that even these subtle acts of exclusion hurt, literally. They do these brain scan studies where they give people subtle exclusion prompts, and they look at what part of the brain lights up when that happens. It's the same part of the brain that lights up as when we experience physical pain. And when that part of the brain is activated, it gets in the way of our mental clarity and our decision making. When it happens again and again and again, which it does for some people, it can cause mental and physical health problems. That's how much of a big deal it is for individuals. And it's not good for organizations either. When people feel that exclusion, they may quietly quit, do the bare minimum. They may actually quit and leave the organization. And takeaway 3 is subtle acts can have huge impacts. Now, research shows we have not been making a lot of progress when it comes to subtle acts of exclusion. When I think about the organizations I've interacted with, I group them into 3 rough phases. Admittedly, way too simplified, but bear with me. The first is blatant exclusion. Harassment, teasing, open and tolerated, sometimes by the leaders themselves. Now, most organizations are past this phase, but you might be surprised at how many are not. And then in the second phase, people have tried to stop those blatant exclusions. Organizations have tried to stop those blatant exclusions, but they often do it by limiting talk and connection around these hard issues rather than leaning into it. I worked with a veterinary hospital where some people felt like they couldn't say the words black lab when a black lab dog came in for treatment. Now, of course, the black people didn't have any problem with anyone saying black lab. And in fact, they found that walking on eggshells performative and insulting. But there was no real conversation taking place. Phase 2 is full of these subtle acts of exclusion. It's often at this stage when organizations reach out for help because they know there's a better place to get to, they just don't know how to do it. These days, there's a pushback to this kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. That pushback is not new. There has always been a pushback in this country when we try to make progress on equity and inclusion. Historically, it has been violent and intentional. These days, it's especially manipulative as they try to convince you that the good progress that's being made, oh, that's actually divisive, that's actually un-American, that's actually racist. They want to roll us back to phase 1 maybe, or keep us stuck in phase 2, where we can't talk about doing any of this good work, where we can't talk about the disparities and the biases and the exclusions. Well, we are not going to let that happen. We need to push forward to a qualitatively different phase. Now, phase 3 is full of mistakes too, but they're active, intentional mistakes. In phase 3, we listen, we speak up, we connect, we try new and hard things, all with vulnerability and authenticity. For an organization to get to this phase, it takes strategy and planning and a lot of individual effort. So what's something you can do? Well, one thing is break the silence. Speak up about subtle acts of exclusion, especially if they're not about you, and especially if you don't even know if they would be a big deal or not. Now, I'm not going to pretend it's always easy. I'm going to tell you a story about a time I thought it would be really easy. I was taking a yoga class. Not here, by the way. The teacher really wanted us to get into the stretch. And she kept saying, don't gyp yourself, GYP. It's a short and derogatory way to talk about gypsies, which is already a derogatory way to talk about a group of people. She kept saying it, so after class I went up to her and I said things like, hey, I know you didn't mean anything by this, and I bet nobody else even noticed. And I don't know if it was my post-yoga endorphins or what, but I sort of expected her to kind of bow and say, namaste, Michael. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. That's not what happened. She looked very uncomfortable, as if her identity as a good person was being threatened. She didn't really look me in the eyes as she left the room. I never took a yoga class with her again, and then I moved out of the state. I mean, not because of that. But 13 years later, I still have this queasy feeling in my stomach when I think about it. I don't know if she remembers it, but I bet she never said that word again. And that queasy feeling that I feel, that's a small price to pay if it leads to our collective growth. So I invite you to take on more of that discomfort so that others can feel less of it. Now you might think, oh, easy for you to say, Michael, you're practiced at all this. Well, takeaway 4 is speak up even if you don't know what to say. You can just say, I'm not sure about that, and then explore it together. I also don't want you to feel like every time you speak up, it's going to be uncomfortable and feel bad. Takeaway 5 is it can feel good to be part of a larger movement. Sometimes, though, those aha moments are filled with gratitude and humility, joy and connection. And when you're the one getting feedback, and you will be, accept that feedback as a gift. That's takeaway 6. Here you are, you're trying to be the best person you can be. You're trying to be the most inclusive person you can be. And you don't always know what's going to make other people feel bad. And here, somebody has taken the time and taken the risk to gift wrap a way for you to be more inclusive with them. Take that as the gift that it is. Don't defend your intentions. Be curious about the impact on them. And even though you messed up, you can build more trust and more connection if you take the feedback well. When one of my children was 3 years old, he went to this great preschool. And every day, before their school lessons, they repeated their values. And one of their values was, we make mistakes. Now that's brilliant because it allowed them to push themselves to try new and hard things, to not feel defensive or ashamed if they made mistakes, to truly grow. Now it doesn't mean you don't try, right? So takeaway 7 is make mistakes as you try your hardest. And it's that same spirit we need now as we resolutely push for more equity and inclusion for everyone, not just in our companies, but in our schools, in our communities, and in the world. Thank you.